Migrating to .NET Core with Derek Comartin.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your humble host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. And I'm excited that more and more people are taking me up on my offer to speak virtually at your .NET user groups. I think I did 2 user group talks last week alone, just virtually, the Trinug and Tulsa and Oklahoma. And it's been a lot of fun. And if you run a .NET user group, I'd love to get on your schedule. I think this season provides an opportunity there just to be an optimist. And if you're tuning into the podcast for the first time, this podcast is for developers shipping software with Microsoft technologies. And my goal for all development teams is for you to be able to move fast, deliver quality, and run your systems with confidence. And if you have some specific issues on anything in Microsoft platform software development, well, that's kind of what I do. I run a software architecture company, and that's what we do. So my guest today, and I'm really excited for this topic, Derek Comartin is a software developer with 2 decades of professional software development experience. He's written software for a variety of business domains, such as distribution, transportation, manufacturing, accounting, and he's the director of engineering at Circle TMS, developing transportation management software using a variety of technologies, including .NET. He founded and leads the Windsor-Essex .NET Developers Group. You can find them on Twitter at WENET Developers. Exploring the use of .NET for building and deploying applications on any platform. He's focused on the various .NET platforms, full framework, core, mono, open source libraries, and various development contexts. And the purpose of his group is to create a great social group in the Windsor-Essex area where individuals can learn from each other. Now, Derek has a very active blog at codeopinion.com, where he focuses on CQRS, event sourcing, HTTP APIs, and Hypermedia. Derek, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thank you. I'm doing good. How are you?
Very well. Very excited for this conversation on migrating to .NET Core, which you've been focused on a lot. But aside from doing a lot of sharing and your work as a Microsoft MVP, for the people not familiar with your work, 2 decades is a long time. But kind of what are the highlights and work up to what you're doing now?
Yeah, it has been a long time. It's since like the late 90s, basically, is when I really got into it professionally as a career. And I don't know if there's highlights, there's moments. I mean, I think every kind of opportunity I had to work on either greenfield projects, existing projects, apps, and just kind of the intro I mentioned there, I've been involved in a lot of different business domains, which have, I think, ultimately helped me the most to relate different industries, because there's a lot of similarities underneath the hoods. Underneath the hood, once you start kind of diving into some of their problems, you'd be surprised how much there's correlation between things like software development and manufacturing, but very specific types of manufacturing. Like people always use those kind of examples. And there's a lot of differences, but there's very specific types of manufacturing that are so close to software development. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, I've said this multiple times, I've cited this stat on multiple shows that because of the explosive growth in our industry, over 50% of the people developing software are in the 0 to 7 years experience range. That means that over half the people were not in the industry before 2013.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about techniques and different things, there's a different split on what's old hat and what's new for the first time.
Yeah, it is. It's especially now. It's with .NET Core, and kind of a renaissance, if you will. I guess there's a large population of developers now that are in .NET that maybe aren't familiar with the the older technologies. Even when I kind of mentioned in some of the talks that I do about SOAP and WCF, there's a portion of those people that have no idea what I'm talking about.
Ancient history.
Yeah.
might as well be COBOL.
Yeah.
Well, you've done a lot of work in migrating to .NET Core, which on the corollary, it's greenfield application, .NET Core from the ground up. What makes it different, and what do you think people need to think about if they're contemplating or even hoping the possibility exists? So
in our situation, we started the app, our transportation software, in about 2015. Mm-hmm. So at that time, that was right at the beginning of what ultimately became .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. So prior to that, there was Katana and Owen, which really is the kind of the precursor to ASP.NET Core. And then their title name or project name, code name, Project K, was kind of happening at the time. So I kind of got the sense of where things were going. So we were making the app using Owen Katana, but using ASP.NET Web API. And I just kind of had a feeling where things were going, and it wasn't going to be in that direction of .NET Framework. So it was just keeping tabs, keeping up to date on what was going on. So for anybody looking to do a migration, that's kind of the biggest part, is really getting your bearings on what the differences are between .NET Framework and .NET Core. Specifically for me, it's about ASP.NET and what the differences were, and just having a plan on what that migration looks like, because depending on the size of your app and what dependencies you have, it can be fairly difficult to kind of, it may feel overwhelming on everything that you need to do, basically. Mm-hmm. So for us, it was kind of a long migration, in the sense that there was no big bang. It wasn't like, hey, let's spend X amount of time trying to do this. Really what it was is over 3 years, probably from 2017, somewhere around there. Once .NET Core 2 came out, that was kind of okay, this seems possible now, to actually migrate our app, our ASP.NET app. So some of the things to kind of really dive into is, and I can explain the way we did it. This is not necessarily the way that you may do it, listener who is contemplating this, but the way we did it was, because it was a slow migration, we were just basically taking a set of tasks that we knew would get us there, and then constantly over, like I said, 3 years, kind of chipping away at these things while normal development was going on. Mm-hmm. So some of those things are, if you're using Web API, for example, right now, you can use Katana still in Owen. And what that allows you to do is get closer to what ASP.NET Core looks like. If you're already using that, then it's kind of like a little bit of a head start. So to migrate, if you're hosting it under IAS, you can use Katana to self-host it, which is kind of like would be the equivalent to what ASP.NET and Kestrel are now. So you can self-host, you can still sit it behind IIS, but you're not using it kind of as the default. And like I said, that is a precursor. So if you're looking at Owen and Katana in ASP.NET Web API, and you're looking at what ASP.NET Core is, you'll be like, oh, this makes entire sense. You can see how the transition happened. I'm curious to ask people on the .NET ASP.NET team if that was intentional, like if it was kind of how they designed it with the startup and everything, because it's almost identical. The names are slightly different, but it's pretty close to the same.
Well, give us the rundown. In 2015, what did the architecture of this system look like, and how many screens, how big of a database? Give us the high level overview of your starting point.
Yeah, so our starting point was so nothing other than it existed. It was basically a web API for the most part, using Owen Katana, and we were self-hosting that as a console app. And then that would just sit behind a load balancer, not IIS. There were kind of main two entry points. There was our web app, like I was just mentioning, and there was another process that was a Windows service that basically just picked up messages in a queue that were derived from like various events or commands and stuff that need to happen within the system, just very reactive, kind of message oriented. So those were kind of the two big players into the whole app. Over time, like I ran NDepend maybe a couple weeks ago to see what the size of the app is now. And not that it gives you any type of full realization of what the system is, but we're at, I think, just over 250,000 lines. Okay. So to me, it's not small. I'd say the number of routes within our app is now it's probably close to 1,000 different screens, different routes. So it's not small by any stretch. Well, to me, it's not.
No, that's pretty large.
Yeah.
So what .NET Framework version did you move from?
Back then, we kept on top of it. So I can't tell you what it was off the top of my head in 2015, but until we did the migration, which was a couple months ago, running in production, we were up to 4.8, basically. So we were at the latest.
So you did your prep work staying on .NET Framework,
correct,
but doing your prep work.
Correct. We had the idea was the goal was to get our app to run on .NET Core with just flipping a switch, meaning that we wanted to get everything to work essentially on .NET Standard 2.0, which is supported by .NET 4.8, as well as .NET Core 2.1. And I'll get into the 2.1 specifically. Yeah. So it was just to get it net standard. If we can get all of our code net standard and get all our dependencies, like all our NuGet packages, if these support net standard, then in essence, we should be able to run them the same app. We should be able to multi-target. We'd be able to build that against .NET Framework and run it on 4.8, as well as .NET Core 2.1, which is LTS as of right now still.
So that should be really encouraging to a lot of people who may be looking at their .NET Framework app and saying, oh, do we have to rewrite this thing? I can't see the path forward.
Exactly. That's why I said this was a long kind of thing coming, because we would just chip away at tasks. And some of those tasks would be exactly that, is what code do we have? One of the tasks is what code do we have that's not supported by .NET Standard? So to do that, there is a tool called the API Portability Analyzer that Microsoft released that you can run as a command line tool. You can run it as a part of a Visual Studio extension. And it basically looks at your solution that you can basically specify what you want to target. So if you specify, hey, I'm looking to target .NET Standard, you run the Portability Analyzer and it will tell you which APIs or types that you're using that are not going to be supported. And at least it gives you, it's not perfect, but it gives you a starting place to see, oh, kind of these are the hot spots in the app. These are the things that we're really using that aren't ever going to be supported. And then from there, you can also find things like, it also gives you some information about, at least you can jump on NuGet to say, oh, this isn't in .NET Core BCL, but there's NuGet packages that are the equivalent now that are .NET Standard. So you can see, okay, there's a way forward here. So that is one path, is to use that. But it doesn't, at least for me, it didn't give me much information about the packages you have and whether they're going to be supported by .NET Standard. So for me at the time, this goes back a couple of years, it was just simply going through all our projects, compiling a list of all the dependencies, one by one, going on NuGet and seeing, okay, the version that we're using now, are they targeting .NET Standard 2? If so, yes, great. If not, let's jump over their GitHub and see, are they planning to? Let's see where this thing's going. If not, if we have no confidence that it's going to happen, because they can't, whatever reasons. Are we willing to fork it and try to do the conversion? Or do we just want to find an alternative package entirely and see if we can make the swap? And in some cases, that was the case for small dependencies. We were like, okay, well, we found an alternative. We'll just modify that particular piece of code, and that's that. But a few years ago, that was kind of a manual process. As a couple months ago, AWS came out with another portability analyzer, which pretty much does the exact same thing, but it also looks at your NuGet package references. And it will tell you, okay, these are supported or these are not supported. So it kind of gives you, it's just a little bit more automated than what the one that the extension from in Visual Studio.
Wow, from Amazon.
Correct. Yep.
Very nice. We'll definitely include that in the show notes.
Yep. And that's just a couple months old at best. It's fairly new.
Okay. Were there any libraries that were a much bigger deal than others?
So for us, probably the biggest dependency that we had that was an issue was going to be Entity Framework.
Mm-hmm. And what version were you on?
So 6.
Okay.
So yeah, whatever it was. Okay. So yeah, it was probably 6.1 was the latest one before, or 6.2. I can't remember exactly, but I want to say the latest right now is 6.4. But as of 6.3 of Entity Framework, they would target .NET Standard 2.1. Now you're like, great, that's awesome. That supports .NET Core 3. Yes, but that was a problem for us because I wasn't trying to target .NET Core 3. And the reason is, where I go back to this, is because, and I realize this is confusing to people with version numbers all over the place here, but ASP.NET Core 3 only will run on .NET Core 3. So when we were mentioning before, if we can get everything Net Standard 2, I can run it on both .NET Framework 4.8 and .NET Core. So I can't jump to .NET Core 3. I need to focus on getting it to run on .NET Core 2.
Yeah.
Which is .NET Standard 2. So for Entity Framework, that wasn't going to be an option because it forced us up and we couldn't do that. So there is a fork called Entity Framework Classic that is .NET Standard. It supports .NET Core, obviously, and it's a 100% drop-in replacement for Entity Framework 6.2 or whatever the last major version change was. So that's what we flipped to. It's literally a drop-in replacement. We've had no issues with it at all. But in some circumstances, we did move to Entity Framework Core in small pieces that we could. But some were just too much of an undertaking, so we just stuck with kind of that fork that supports .NET Core, or .NET Standard, I should say.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
Yeah, because Entity Framework, they did their own, what pretty much looks like a ground-up rewrite from the 6.x to the core versions.
Yeah, so it's possible. Like if you, again, what I was mentioning at the beginning, our route was just to get everything to a point where it could run on both, essentially. And going to 6.3 or 4, whatever Entity Framework now supports .NET Core, that's great, but it only supports .NET Core 3. And I can't run .NET Core 3 and .NET Framework 4.8 in our app at the same time. The only two that are going to be compatible are 2.1 Core and .NET Framework 4.8, which we were on.
So you had an IIS website, and then you had an offline job that was running as a Windows service? Is that what it was?
Correct, yep.
And what was the hosting model at the time?
So both of them were console apps that were just basically sitting as a Windows service using Top Shelf in a container, or in just in a VM. In a
VM, okay.
Yep. And then that kind of scaled out.
Okay. And what's the hosting model now?
So it is in process of migrating from that to containers and Linux now that we're running on .NET Core.
Okay. So still one website and one offline
it's the
job.
same, exactly. Yeah, just hosting it different.
Okay.
Yeah, just deployed differently.
And is that in Azure or AWS?
In AWS.
Okay.
Yep. So looking at moving from EC2 to ECS.
Gotcha. Okay. Are you doing anything with Kubernetes or just leaving it?
We are not.
Okay.
No. Whether we do go down that road, I don't exactly know. I mean, we already use ECS for other kind of side parts to this, like side apps that are just for kind of clients, if you will, to these pieces. So I don't know if we'll go there, but we already use ECS and have a lot of it configured that way. So we're familiar with it.
Mm-hmm. We had one of our recent guests, Mike Sigsworth, talked about a pretty intense Kubernetes implementation. If you listeners want to go back and listen to that show, and he kind of gives he shares that it was not a walk in the park to get Kubernetes up and running, and we kind of talked about it. It shouldn't be that hard, and probably a few years from now it won't be as hard. But when you deal with cutting edge, you tend to cut yourself and bleed a little bit. Yeah.
Well, that's even when we started using ECS years ago. There was a little bit of a learning curve there, but now it's not so bad.
Yeah. Down the road, we'll look back and say, "Oh, containers. Oh, well, you just run the command. They're automatic. What's so hard about it?"
Yeah, pretty much.
Once all the tooling catches up. So you mentioned .NET Standard 2 instead of 2.1. That is key because I think
it is.
.NET Framework 8 is all we're going to get from .NET Framework, isn't it?
Yeah. So .NET Framework 4.8 will only support .NET Standard 2. So that's kind of the end of the line, right? So that kind of proves kind of like if your migration path was going to be similar to ours, is to be able to chip away and get everything .NET Standard 2.0 compliant. You can then at that point, for example, flip over to 2.1, which is what we did. So our deployment kind of strategy for this was we would build both versions of the web app and kind of our worker job processing app for both. And what we did was we would just deploy one instance of the many that was using then .NET Core, right? So we just had one instance there running, and then we would just keep swapping them out little by little, just to make sure there was no kind of behavioral differences, which there were. So, but that was kind of our, okay, let's test the waters here to make sure everything's behaving as you think it would. And a couple of the things to kind of watch out for there's two. So there's runtime issues and compile time issues that you could run into. The compile time issues are awesome because you know about them.
Yeah.
Which are, and I'm kind of surprised I don't hear more about this. Maybe they do. It's just maybe my Twitter bubble or my social bubble. I don't hear so much about this. But if you have a NuGet package and you are, for example, using .NET 4.8, and I can give a good example of this is the AWS SDK, specifically their S3 SDK for kind of like their file blob storage. You could be using the exact same version, but the version, like the actual assembly within that NuGet package, they target differently if you're running on .NET Framework or whether you're running on something that's going to target .NET Standard, like .NET Core. And what happens there is the assemblies aren't the same. You're using different assemblies. And they decided to remove synchronous methods in their SDK. So in S3, there's a method called, on the client, called put object, which basically just sends a request to upload whatever your document is. Put document does not exist in the .NET Standard version.
Oh.
It's only put async. They've turned them all from public to either private or protected or internal, and you can't access them. So those are obvious. The moment you start trying to build targeting .NET Core, you'll notice those. Now that can be a significant problem because you went from a synchronous method to an asynchronous method, and async await is so pervasive through your code. Yeah, it's viral. So depending on where you're making that call, and all of a sudden you need to make that call asynchronously, and you need to await it, now you're going up all the way to the call stack to make that happen. Luckily for us, it wasn't so much of an issue, but I can imagine for other people that could be a little bit of a sticking point. So be aware that, yes, you look at NuGet, you're like, yes, this package supports .NET Standard. But you can see in NuGet what the dependencies are, and you can see if they target .NET Standard, maybe what the transitive dependencies are. If they if they're multi-targeting is what it's called. If you're multi-targeting, be prepared that it may not be the exact same behaviors or API surface. It actually can be different, even though you're using the same version.
And that's because you can still be .NET Standard, but you can modify the public-private accessor modifiers.
Yeah. So when you're even in your own code, you can write. They're called if defs. You could basically write an if statement that's for the compiler, depending on when you're building, saying if I'm building against .NET Framework, use this piece of code. And that's essentially what I'm assuming they did, is that those APIs don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So, but luckily you can find those once you're able to actually build on .NET Core. You'll find out those issues immediately. A little bit more difficult are runtime issues and differences. So some of those, I never experienced any within kind of the BCL itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's always to do with packages, NuGet packages, for the exact same reason. So an example of this is Noda Time. So Noda Time is basically, in my opinion, kind of the default standard, what you should be using for date times or anything time zone related.
Let's pause real quick, because I think there's probably a lot of listeners who heard you say that, but then they're probably thinking, I've never heard of Noda Time. What do you mean? It's datetime.now, right? So just for the people who've never even, who haven't had to deal with time zones because there are people out there that still haven't, or they've dealt with it, but they've just kind of had to do it themselves. Give the quick, in your words, why Noda Time should be the standard.
Because it is so complicated. It's amazing how many issues that I had no idea of were concepts related to time zones. And especially when you're thinking about forward in time and when you're recording date times forward in time across time zones, mm-hmm. and daylight savings time zones, or their offsets changing. It takes a lot of the legwork and creates all the types that, at least for me, and then reading the docs gives it a little bit more of an aha, other than I just have a date time or date time offset type that's in the BCL, which doesn't fully express how complicated it all is. So Noda Time, I believe, was, or at least when it was created, was what would you call that? A port of Joda time? Yeah, a port of Joda time in Java. So, and that, I don't know if, I'm assuming it's still maintained and actively developed by John Skeet. I think that's the primary.
Yep.
author.
Yeah, I think so too.
So we use it pretty much everywhere. And we had an issue with serialization of a zone date time. So a zone date time it just encapsulates the information about a date time and what particular time zone it relates to. And the issue we had was how that serialized with .NET Framework 4.8 was different than how it serialized when we were running under .NET Core. And that was particularly a problem because that data was then persisted in a place that another part of our app was handling. So we noticed this at runtime when we were serializing it one way, and then, like say under .NET Framework, that got stored. We tried to deserialize it, but it was trying to deserialize in .NET Core, and that was blowing up, basically. So the issue there is exactly the same problem I mentioned with the AWS SDK, is that yes, you're referencing the same version, but there's actually code behavior differences this time. And digging into the code, turns out this wasn't much of an issue because the latest version as of today, I think it's like 3 point something, fixed this issue. And they don't multi-target anymore. It's just, there's just one assembly. When you get that NuGet package, no matter where you're using it, you're just using that same version. So those two, like the behavior things are, I guess, depending on what package you're using, you're going to rely on tests. I'm going to assume you're going to find a lot of these things in production like we did, but it wasn't so much of an issue because of how we deployed it. Like I said, just deploying kind of one instance at a time that was running on .NET Core and letting everything else just be on .NET Framework. And that way we could kind of capture through logs what issues were. And once we noticed something, it was immediately, okay, get that one instance out of there. There's clearly a problem.
Yeah. Well, as we kind of close out here, you mentioned going slow and doing one at a time, but you just mentioned tests. What levels of test suites did you find to be helpful with the migration? Not just knowing that the app works, but actually finding the issues so that you didn't have to find everything in production.
So I think most of the stuff that was really an issue, none of our tests covered because of the exact issue that I was just describing of having something happen, almost communicating in a way between .NET Core and .NET Framework. If we have multiple instances, some are running .NET Core, some are running .NET Framework, we never really had anything that could even simulate that. Like we would have to have a test that was running under one runtime, but maybe already had that, like the file, how it was already serialized, which we did after the fact once we realized this. So hopefully if you're planning on doing this, maybe that's a pro tip now is look at how stuff gets serialized, because that can definitely be an issue, and then write tests accordingly. But we didn't have any tests that helped us in any of those particular issues. I would say for the most part, we didn't really run into any like runtime issues besides serialization. Mm-hmm. So it was always small tasks. Let's convert some code that will get us there. And it might take another 3 weeks before somebody works on something else again. Right. So like it wasn't a big bang of we're going to do all these changes. It was maybe a series of 5-6 steps of, converting our code, getting dependencies, ASP.NET Core moving over, all those things to line up, and then kind of start rolling it out.
Okay. And what version of .NET Core are you on now?
We're on 3.1. So once we got to 2.1 and we were on ASP.NET Core 2.1, the migration to 3.1 was, I wouldn't say it was non-trivial, but it wasn't an ordeal at all. It maybe took a couple of days to kind of work the kinks out there, but it wasn't an issue at all.
Awesome. And are you, do you have the appetite to be planning your move to .NET 5 in a few months? Or are you going to wait a little while and let other people?
I need to take a break at this point. We'll let it come out, and maybe once the dust settles a little bit with it. But it's great that all the optimizations, that's the biggest gain from all of it, is all the perf that we're getting, all the future ads that get added to it, to leverage all of that. And we've noticed that it's simple. I'll get a really simple example of how this benefited us was HTTP2. And that's just standard out of the box, right? Before we couldn't get that with .NET Framework.
Okay.
And self-hosting. So all those advancements, you're kind of stuck in the water with whatever 4.8 is. That's what it's going to be.
Right. And final question for you. You mentioned performance. You went from VMs to containers. Do you have any numbers of how much CPU or memory or resources that you're having to use now for a similar transaction level?
I don't yet, because mainly our biggest thing is it's not even just jumping to containers so much as it is moving to Linux. Mm-hmm. So right now everything is still running in Windows, and we've been testing in our development scenarios it running in Linux. So we'll see where that goes. We know based on some of our other code that is already running that way, I'm going to guess it's significant in terms of that as price alone in AWS is like 25% cheaper from Windows instances. So there's a nice cost savings there that we'll benefit from. Yeah,
25% is nothing to sneeze at. That's for sure. All right. Well, awesome. Well, Derek, thanks so much for sharing your migration story. And that was some really good pro tips. As you went through it, you didn't go into it thinking, I'm going to have to rewrite this, and you found the path forward. If anyone is looking to find you, your blog is on codeopinion.com. Any other resources you want to throw out before we close out here?
I mean, the Microsoft docs are fairly good. There's a little section on there on migrating, which have been helpful, especially for things like data protection and machine key and where that goes, because you're going to have to move that over. Mm-hmm. So the docs are pretty good there. The portability analyzers, like I mentioned, are a great starting point to kind of give you an idea of really the undertaking that you're looking at. So definitely those.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show. This has been fascinating. I appreciate it. I know everyone else is going to get a lot of benefit from it.
Thanks a lot.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.